Our second reading this morning is from the book of Acts. We do not often hear from the book of Acts. Acts chapter 17 and verses 21 to 31. The Spirit might speak something into your life from this reading in Acts, and so I would invite you to listen with fresh ears to what the Spirit might say to you. Now all the Athenians and the foreigners living there in Athens would spend their time in nothing but telling and hearing something new. Then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, "Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.' What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is God served with human hands, as though God needed anything, since God gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. From one ancestor, God made all the nations to inhabit the whole earth, and God allotted the times and their seasons of their existence, and the boundaries of the places where they could live, so that they would search for God, and perhaps grope for God, and find God. Though indeed, God is not far from each one of us. For in God we live and move and have our being. As even some of your poets have said, for we too are God's offspring. Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and the imagination of mortals. While God has overlooked the times of human ignorance, now God commands all people everywhere to repent, because God has fixed a day on which God will have the world judged in righteousness by a man whom God has appointed. And of this, God has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, as I begin my sermon today, I wanted to point out that I'm calling it Youth Sunday. It's actually Graduate Sunday, when we honor our graduates, all 5 of whom are here present today, and we're going to be giving them gifts later on. And some of them are participating in worship leadership, and we're grateful for that. At the very end of the service, we are going to try to sing an unsingable hymn that is beautiful and that is for the graduates. It's actually a very popular hymn, and I'm glad we have it in the new hymnal. But as I thought about this reading from the book of Acts, it made me think about all the many altars that we have to choose from in this world. Today in the city of Athens, that missionary Paul, who wrote so much of the Bible, he comes across all these many altars, and finally he comes to one that is to an unknown God. As if, well, there surely must be other gods that we didn't count, and we don't want them to get mad, so we'll put an altar here for them too. It would be like getting mail addressed to current resident, I guess, if you were the unknown God. But they had all kinds of gods. No matter what you wanted, you had a god for that. Just like an app. You had your god. If your thing was beauty or love, you had Aphrodite. You could go and, for a price, you could ask Aphrodite to bring you love or beauty. Athena was the goddess of wisdom and reason and war for some reason. Wisdom, reason, and war, I don't know. But she got all 3 of those, and if you wanted any of those 3 or success in any of those, you'd go and you'd grease her palm and you'd pray to her. Hades ruled the world of the dead, and he looked really cool. If you cared about somebody who had died, you might go to Hades and give him a little wine or a little bit of a incense and ask him to be nice to the person you loved who had died. Apollo was the best. Apollo got all the cool stuff. Apollo was one busy god. Apollo got art and poetry and music and archery and plagues. COVID-19, that was all Apollo. Prophecy, healing, sunlight. Apollo got it. And if you needed any of those things, you'd give your little gift to Apollo, and hopefully he'd be pleased to give you what you asked for. And there were hundreds more gods to choose from, all of them waiting to grant you blessings as long as you gave them a little something and bowed before them. A little meat, a little wine, a little incense, a little blood. The gods were there for you if you were there for them. Gods of laughter, gods of play, gods of desire. Even Pan, who was my personal favorite. Pan, the god of the forest, who had the best music. There was Pan. He played the pan flute. Some of them were evil. Some of them were kind. Some of them were beautiful. Some of them were hideous. Some of them were dangerous and cagey. And like all gods, the only thing they wanted was everything you have. Everything you have. Surely there was a God for you. Which one would it be? Or which two or three would it be? Or which one is it, should I ask? For we all worship at the shrine of something or another. We all worship at the shrine of someone or another. We all choose the shrines where we will offer the sacrifice of our living. We choose our shrines, or maybe they choose us, I don't know. And then we spend our days and our hours and our studies and our careers and our free time and our vacant thoughts wearing a path to those altars, those shrines, where our lives go up like the incense of prayer. Graduates, these lives of yours that stretch out before you, full of promise and full of hope, you will spend them at some shrine or another. Make sure you spend these precious lives kneeling at the altar of the God who gives whether you do or not, who forgives, who heals, who offers hope and strength for each new day. Spend these lives not bartering for favors from the changing gods of this world, but in relationship with the God who is love itself, and whose love depends on nothing that you do and nothing that you can offer. Your life is a prayer. Your life is a prayer, and how you spend it is your daily worship. Choose wisely among the many altars in this world. On an episode of the old sitcom Everybody Loves Raymond, it's a Sunday morning and everybody's going to church. I know this because I leave the TV on for the dogs when I go to work in the morning. And this one actually drew me in. It's a Sunday morning and the whole family's going over to church. Raymond's long-suffering wife and daughter are waiting, and Raymond's parents come over because they live right across the street so that they can all go to church together, and Raymond's bachelor brother shows up. It's a big Italian family, all headed off to Mass. But Raymond stays home. He always stays home. They try to pressure him a little, they give him a little bit of guilt, but he just doesn't want to do it. He doesn't want to go. He says, the kneeling is hard on my knees. There's a football game. It's not till 1 o'clock, but there's a football game. I get distracted in church, he says. I end up looking at the scalp of the person in front of me. He stays home. Later that day, his 10-year-old daughter shows him a picture that she has drawn that's mostly orange and yellow with a person in it. It's her daddy Raymond burning in hell. What? He says, who told you that I was going to hell? Who even told you about hell? Grandpa did, she says. It's a funny show. Raymond rushes across the street to confront his father for telling his daughter about hell, which is a thing I've had to do with one of the grandparents myself. Why are you telling my daughter about hell? Well, why don't you go to church? The grandfather says. People are saying maybe I didn't raise you right. I don't feel like going to church, Raymond says. And of course, his mother, if you ever saw the show and you remember that character, it's all guilt. I don't feel like going to church. Why do you hurt me? I could never yell at you the way your father does because I know that all of your failings are my fault. She's a great one for laying on the guilt, this mother of Raymond. Later, Raymond is talking to his wife at home, and she says to him, "Really, honey, why don't you just go to church?" And his answer is basically, "It's just so boring. I just get bored at church. I get distracted. I start to think about other things." "Why do you go to church?" he asks her. And she gets thoughtful, and she says, "Well, I go to give thanks for you and for our daughter. I go because it reminds me that I'm part of something more than just me. I'm part of something bigger. It gives me kind of a weekly reset," she says. "I go because of the tradition and the ritual and the community." And she says that she thinks that Raymond's dad wants him to go to church because faith is the only good thing the old man gave his two children. And so Raymond decides grudgingly, "Okay, I'll go to church next week." The priest is suspicious. Raymond's dad is an usher at the church, it turns out. And he gets to spend the whole hour not in here, but out there in the narthex with the other ushers, joking and talking about the pretty girls inside the church and betting on sports and getting credit for being in church without sitting through any of it. Raymond catches him and declares, "If I got to come to church, I'm going to be an usher too." And one old fellow says, "Good luck. Every man in this church wants to be an usher." It's a 20-year waiting list. By the way, we are looking for ushers. And it doesn't have to be men. And you do indeed get credit for being here. Raymond returns to the pews where his brother and his mother and his wife and his daughter are all paying attention to the priest, who kind of drones on and on like any adult in the Peanuts cartoons. And he can't do it. He's so bored. It doesn't speak to his heart. He starts playing with the hair, what turns out to be the toupee of the man in front of him. And he turns to his brother and asks, "What's wrong with this guy's scalp?" I'd forgotten what a good show that was. But all of life is worship. And even those of us who do come to church, we probably have a few select shrines where we spend the hours of our lives in this world, praying to the gods of our choosing. All our living is a prayer, and the thoughts and the energies that we spend in these lives, those are our worship. Let us make sure that we direct them to the worthy God, the right God, for there is no lack of gods who want them. You know, I've never been to Athens. We came this close to going. I've heard that it's a pretty sleepy kind of place today. It's not one of the tall, glittering cities of the world. But in the first century, it was something like Boston or Berkeley. It was like the intellectual capital of the empire. A place where people dreamed up progressive new ideas, things like democracy. A place where philosophers did their TED Talks. A place where great writers lived. Studying philosophy might no longer be the fast track to a brilliant career. But in Paul's times, philosophers were the closest thing they had to scientists. They were the experts in every field from religion to physics to medicine. And there in Athens, Paul sees the altars to all the many gods that they worshipped and goddesses. But even by that time in history, people were getting tired of those gods. Those gods were cagey. Those gods were weird. Those gods were hard to get on your side. They were hard to believe in. Gods with horns and fur and all that. A lot of people preferred to find meaning in the newer philosophies of the day. But among the many altars in that great city, Paul comes across a shrine to the unknown God, the poor unknown God. They just wanted to cover all their bases. And Paul gives us perhaps his most eloquent sermon here. He preaches to the people of Athens. He says, I'll tell you who the unknown God is. The God who made the world and everything in it, who does not live in altars and shrines, and who's not served by human hands, but rather the God who serves all by giving them life and breath and food. This God, whom you call unknown, decided that everything would exist that exists. And when and who? This God is not far, for in this God we live. In this God we move and breathe and exist. And then he goes on to say that we have known this God in the life of the person of Jesus. You're going to devote your life to something. A few of these many gods will claim your allegiances down through the years. Your time and your resources will be given on some altar of your choosing, possibly 2 or 3. Choose the God who blesses at all times, who gives freely, and who loves without payment, without reward. Your living itself is a prayer. But really, what is worship and who really does it? We call this a worship service, but what does that mean? What does it mean to worship in this 21st century? Worship means to admire something or someone. It means to desire them. It means to hold them in reverence, to hold them in awe. Worship means to offer your devotion, your thoughts, your energies. Do we really do that in these times? Do we direct those things to any sort of God, whether it's Aphrodite or the God we know in Jesus? How? When? People used to worship because they were scared. There were devils out there in the world. There was black magic. There were dangers everywhere. And to make it worse, God was usually on the side of the powerful and the rich. That's how they got powerful and rich in the first place. In the Middle Ages, the church had to come up with communion wafers that would kind of melt in your mouth because people were trying to hide the bread under their tongue and take it home and feed it to any sick animals that they might have because they believed it was magic. They believed it was some sort of thing that could ward off the evil that was making their animals sick. You worshiped because you had no power, and you wanted to get the powers that be on your side. You went to church so that God would notice you and do nice things for you. But now, has it ever crossed your mind at communion to hide the bread and take it home to your sick animal? I am quite certain that it has not. If you have a sick animal, you call a vet. If you have depression, you know it's not caused by a devil. It's caused by chemicals. We know. It's important to stay positive and to stay hydrated and to exercise and to eat right. Who worships anything, really? Maybe we worship health. Maybe we worship our image. But for the most part, we have too much power to worship. We have recourse. We have life coaches. We have therapists. We have specialists in every field of medicine and technology. We don't worship anymore. And to boot, we've seen our heroes fall. And we've seen their shadow side. And we've seen some positive things in some of our villains. What is there to worship and whom? But the unknown God that Paul sees among the many altars in Athens is not like the other gods who needs to be paid first. This God is already giving all good things to a world that mostly doesn't even notice the good gifts that we receive. This God loves without being loved in return most of the time. This God isn't necessarily present in any shrine, but present without being sought, the one in whom we live and move and have our being. This one will ask much of us, yes, but will give whether we give back or not. This one we worship out of gratitude and out of love, not as a means of getting something we want or need. We worship this God because we're grateful, not because we're scared. A few years ago in the back pew of the church, as the service was over and I was kind of collecting my things, I saw a young father in this church praying in the back pew like this, leaning against the pew in front of him. And you don't often see that in this church. I mean, quite frankly, I was deeply touched. And as I sneaked away, trying not to disturb him, I noticed that it was actually a cell phone that he was holding in his cupped hands. A new study out of Australia estimates that the average Australian today lives to be about 83 years old, which is 6 years more than Americans get. And they will spend 34 of those years, 40% of their lives, in front of some kind of screen or another. 34 years. That's a whole adult life that used to be considered middle-aged. 34 years. Now, that includes being at work and being at the movies and watching TV and being on your phone. 34 years. Looking for what? Our daily bread? Funny cat videos? Social connections? Amusement? Stimulation? A little uptick in our dopamine levels? To think that 34 years, some of us haven't even seen 34 yet. To think that 34 years of our lives could be spent in this way, at these which might be called shrines, engaged in what might be called a form of prayer. I don't know if I'll get another 34 years, but if I do not want them to be spent doing that. I want them to be spent in meaningful ways with people I care about. I want them to be spent among the trees. I want them to be spent paying attention to beauty and caring about good things. Our lives are a prayer, and the way we spend them is our worship. To what gods are we praying in this maze of modern Athens, where deities of every size and shape and every power are all crying out for our attention and for our alms, our gifts? We all worship what we do not know: power, money, sex, beauty, popularity, being loved. Who doesn't love to be loved? But there is a God who needs no shrine, whose favors come with no strings attached, whose altar is the world and every human heart, and all acts of kindness and wonder and joy are gifts to the worship of this God. All intelligence in its many, many forms is God's light in this world, and however you put your brains and your body to work, you are shedding that light out into God's world. You're sharing it. There is a God who is not moved or manipulated, but who loves only what is good and sincere, the one in whom we live and move and have our being. And so, you graduates, hear me say this. I hope we have not bored you so badly that you have spent these years with us wondering what's up with the scalp of the person sitting in front of you. It's not likely, since it is likely, that you had 5 or 6 empty pews in front of you rather than somebody's scalp. In our awkward, imperfect, and perhaps sometimes a little outdated ways, we have tried to point you to a truth, that we too are reaching for and sometimes failing to grasp. But we have known it in our lives, and we hope that you will know it in yours. It is a hope that never leaves you, a peace that you cannot begin to understand, that comes upon you only when you need it and leaves you when you don't. It is a joy that carries you through sorrow. It is a love that makes the world better for everyone and that bears you into every year to come. It is God. We've tried to point you toward God, and we hope that you will do the same for us when we lose our way and begin to worship our traditions and our rituals and our buildings instead of God. Your life is a prayer. How you spend it is your worship. Like Athens, this world will offer you so many gods to choose from, and you'll probably choose a few favorites, and each of them will take everything that you can give it. Pick carefully among the altars of this world. Your energy and your passion must be spent in the right places. Give them to a God whose love is always free, who walks even with the undeserving, and whose desire is the happiness and the well-being of all. This is the God that we have seen in the person of Jesus. Amen.